welcome to the honors presentation of the Public Policy Program. My name is Marcelo Pérez and I'm Director of the Honors Program. I would like to thank you all for coming today to this important event. Writing an honors thesis is the academic pinnacle of an undergraduate degree, and our honors students, instead of just studying from a textbook or doing problem sets or writing a paper for a class, decided to go for it, come up with an interesting research question, and spend a lot of time and effort answering it and making a significant contribution to the field. So that's why I want to say to our honors students that we're proud of you. We're proud of you because you took the risk in engaging in independent research. We're proud of you for the very long hours you put into solving this problem, and we're proud of you for your successful achievement and conclusion of this project. We're very excited about your presentations and we're looking forward to it. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Rebecca Sachs, who will be talking to us about job lock and health insurance premium evidence from the Massachusetts healthcare reform.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Sachs, and my thesis is titled Job Lock and Health Insurance Premiums, Evidence from the Massachusetts Healthcare Reform. I've been completing this research over the past year under the supervision of Professor John Pinecavel. The motivation for my thesis lies in the current debate in Washington surrounding the potential implications of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act reaches its full implementation in January 2014. Given that 55% of all Americans rely on an employer for health insurance, healthcare reform is bound to have consequences in the labor market. A specific consequence I'm interested in is the potential for healthcare reform to reduce job lock. Job lock occurs when workers stay in jobs they might otherwise leave for fear of losing access to affordable healthcare coverage. Job lock has been a topic in the economic literature for over 50 years. The basic idea is that there's a bond created between the employer and the employee by fringe benefits, one of which is employer-sponsored insurance. This bond may be an issue if there's a match-specific component of productivity that makes workers more productive in some jobs than in others, and the bond keeps them from making those productivity-enhancing movements. More formally, a worker derives utility from their wages, their fringe benefits, including health care, and non-monetary variables associated with their job. A worker changes jobs to maximize this utility. The issue is that differences in wages do not perfectly offset differences in the valuation of healthcare across jobs, and productivity is not equal to total compensation. Literature has found that job lock exists. A particular group that job lock is especially acute for is those with pre-existing health conditions. To the extent that the PPACA regulates discrimination in the labor market, it's widely expected to reduce job lock for this group. A larger question remains how the PPACA will affect job lock for the population as a whole. My research question is whether a decrease in individual market premium prices will reduce job lock. In 2011, Congress tasked the Government Accountability Office with answering this question. The experts they interviewed found that they were unable to predict the effect of lower premium prices under healthcare reform on job lock. This is because there's been limited research on the topic. It's a very difficult relationship to quantify because data is not readily available that gives the price of alternative prices of insurance. However, in theory, a reduction in premium prices diminishes the value placed on the healthcare one receives from their employer and should reduce job lock. To answer this question, I used data surrounding the 2006 Massachusetts healthcare reform. I used Massachusetts healthcare reform as a natural experiment. The rest of my presentation is as follows. I give a bit more background on Massachusetts healthcare reform, provide my data and methodology in addition to a simple model, provide results, and end with a few concluding thoughts. Massachusetts healthcare reform is very similar to the PPACA. In fact, the PPACA was largely modeled after Massachusetts healthcare reform. As a result, it's been kind of a hit thing to do in health economics to use Massachusetts to estimate potential effects of the PPACA. They both emphasize shared responsibility between the employer, the individual, and the government, and include health insurance exchanges, subsidized coverage, an individual mandate, and an employer mandate. The big difference is that Massachusetts has no pre-existing condition regulations. This is because Massachusetts was ahead of the curve and passed regulations in the 1980s and the 1990s that the PPACA doesn't implement nationally until next year. As a result of Massachusetts reform, 411,000 additional residents were insured 2 years after its implementation. There was a decrease in the price of individual market insurance as well. This was due to the creation of the Health Connector. The Health Connector is what we think of as a traditional health insurance exchange. It merged the individual and small group market. The mechanisms by which these small groups and individuals had access to cheaper insurance is Commonwealth choice. This table presents evidence on the top 4 health insurance providers in Massachusetts before and after reform. As you can see in this column, between the difference between a standard plan in 2006 before reform and the top plan available after reform was about 28%. For those below 300% of the federal poverty line, the decrease was even more significant. This is because the government subsidized health insurance for these individuals. For someone at between 150 and 200% of the federal poverty level who didn't have access to Medicaid before, they now can receive insurance at $39 a month. There's a large difference between $500 a month insurance and $39 a month insurance. Massachusetts residents internalized this decrease in the cost. Between 2006 and 2009, 25% fewer individuals cited unmet need due to cost. In order to use Massachusetts reform, I used data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation from the 2 years prior to reform's passage and 2 years following its full implementation. I'm happy to talk more about my decision to use SIP data if anyone has questions later. While I could use a basic difference in differences model to estimate the equation, it's not satisfactory. This is because job loss is an individual problem, and there's individual variables that are highly associated with an individual's likelihood of changing jobs. I therefore compare the probability of turnover for observationally equivalent employees in different states before and after reform. My dependent variable is the probability that an individual leaves their job. This could be moving to a different source of employment, moving to self-employment, or even moving to unemployment. The only regulation is that they cannot be unemployed for more than a year over the 2 years I look at the individual. I use a probit model because it's a probability on this side, and I don't want to get a variable that's below 0 or above 1. The first half of my equation is aimed at finding a proper estimate for job loss, which is beta 1, the relationship between employer-sponsored insurance and the probability that one leaves their job. Whatever beta 1 is, that's how much less likely someone with employer-sponsored insurance is to leave their job than their observationally equivalent. I use a series of individual variables, your education, your age, your race, and state variables. I then include a series of additional controls derived from the literature. I use spouse variables, whether your spouse has access to employer-sponsored insurance. Bridget Madrian found in 1994 that those with access to insurance through their spouse were much less susceptible to job loss because they had an alternative source of insurance. I then include good job characteristics. Gillespie and Lutz found in 2002 that characteristics such as pension and wages were correlated with job loss. This is because if you don't include these variables, the jobs that have health insurance are different than jobs without it, and you may just be accounting for the quality of those jobs or the desirability of those jobs. I then include tenure. This is control derived from a paper written in 1996. The idea here is that those with higher turnover propensities will move more. And finally, I include my own variable, which is firm size, since individuals at large firms have more opportunities to turn over within the firm and are therefore less susceptible to job loss. Finally, I include the unemployment rate in the state in a given year. This is because Massachusetts healthcare reform went into effect at the same time as the economy was heading into a recession. The second part of my equation is aimed at estimating the effect of Massachusetts healthcare reform on job loss. Beta 6 is a variable that shows the effect of reform on job loss. My basic results show that job loss exists at a significant level in the economy as a whole, but that Massachusetts healthcare reform does not significantly affect job loss. Unless you're really good at taking derivatives, this shouldn't mean much to you. So I've done the derivatives for you, and I found that the rate of job loss in Massachusetts is 6.5%. This is a bit less than the literature has found. That makes sense for a variety of reasons. And I found that the reduction in job loss is 0.068 of a percentage point, and it's not significant. This translates into roughly a 1% decrease in job loss. In order to test the robustness of these results, I run additional specification tests. As you can see, the first table presents the same results as my previous slide. My first specification test is to look at transitions into self-employment. This is because one may argue that individuals who move from employer to employer don't care about the rate of individual market insurance, whereas those who move into self-employment due to the individual mandate very much so will care about this rate. I find that it's still not significant for these groups, and the reduction in job loss is about 1.5%, which is similar to the 1%. My next specification test is to look at voluntary turnover. The question here is whether I controlled properly for the macroeconomic variables at the time, and I find that my results do not change by just looking at this specification. Madrian found in her 1994 paper that whether you put it as voluntary or voluntary and involuntary transitions doesn't change your results. So this is consistent with what she found. For my final test, I look at individuals below 300% of the federal poverty level, and for these individuals, I find a 30% reduction in job loss. However, I'm taking these results with a grain of salt because they're not significant. The sample becomes very small when you isolate it, and there's also a specification issue where those with lower incomes tend to change jobs more, so it's a bit of an endogenous test. In conclusion, I've found that a decrease in the price of individual market premiums do not reduce job loss in Massachusetts. This implies that the effect of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act on job loss may be smaller than originally anticipated. However, my paper leaves lingering questions regarding the effect on premium prices for those with pre-existing conditions. It's possible that in addition to the regulations, these less expensive premiums may have an additional effect for these groups that we don't see in the population as a whole, but due to the nature of the Massachusetts healthcare reform, I'm unable to quantify this result. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can you just clarify that last point? You think that the pre-existing condition thing would be a big effect?
Yeah,
Why can't you isolate it in Massachusetts?
So the idea, so there's two things going on in national healthcare reform. I can actually change to this slide, which is insurance market reforms, discuss them both a little bit, but there's something called guaranteed issues and community ratings. Under guaranteed issue, you can't discriminate against someone based on their health conditions and a variety of other factors. Under community ratings, everyone has to have insurance within a specific range. So essentially what I'm saying is under the PPACA, there's two effects. There's this everyone must have health insurance, and then there's the additional everyone must have health insurance within this additional range. But in Massachusetts, those with pre-existing conditions are already receiving health insurance at similar rates to those without. So they're experiencing the same decrease, where in national reform, they're getting health insurance for the first time, but in addition to this decrease, they're finally receiving health insurance in places like Louisiana at the same general price as the population as a whole. And actually, I was thinking an interesting way to measure this is that different states implemented guaranteed issues and community ratings at different times. So I could actually apply my model to look at those states and see how it affects that group.
Should be interesting work for next year. Thanks, Rebecca.
I've been reading about some of the problems that are not being fixed because the Congress can't agree to fix them. So what are some of these issues, the way you see them?
I mean, the way I see it, cost control was still a really big issue in Massachusetts. So even though insurance prices were going down, the state's still struggling to pay everything. As far as healthcare reform and its effect on job lock, if you're trying to get on this, what I took away from my results actually was that job lock, even though I said that job lock exists for the population as a whole, it's been a very heavily debated topic, because no matter how you measure job lock, unless you're using a natural experiment like Massachusetts healthcare reform, you're letting yourself have some endogeneity. If you look at people with spouses with health insurance and without, couples make joint mobility decisions. So it's hard to estimate that relationship, and what I'm taking, this non-significant and non-trivial decrease, to me, is that job lock may not exist for the population as a whole to the same extent that some economists are thinking it does. So it makes me doubt the presence of job lock for those without pre-existing conditions more than it makes me doubt the ability of reform to reduce job lock.
So you didn't have any data about pre-existing conditions in there that you could have checked to see if they were...
So it's actually, so my decision to use the SIP data actually comes from that. SIP has been described as the optimal data to measure job lock because it provides direct evidence on transitions and has a longitudinal aspect. The great thing about SIP is that it also has topical modules where they'll ask you very detailed questions about your health. The unfortunate thing about SIP is that funding to it got cut between 2007 and 2008, so it made the data a little bit iffy for extracting data that should have been available on health conditions. But it would be a really interesting application of these results to test with another data set, I think.
You did some field research in Massachusetts, right?
Yeah.
You talked to some people. You did mention what
Yes.
you learned from that. Can you talk about?
So I got a UAR grant to go to Massachusetts earlier this quarter to talk to two people who actually sat on the Health Insurance Connector Board. And one of them, Jonathan Gruber, has written a lot on job lock. And I talked to them a lot about reform. And they helped key me into this price decrease, and that was really significant, a significant thing to look at. But what I really came away from it was a better understanding of how the employer mandate and the individual mandate affect job lock. And the real idea there that I think makes my results exciting is that because of the employer mandate, differences across good jobs such as pensions, your wages, they still vary. But now 98% of employers provide health insurance. So this idea of having health insurance is no longer really associated with having a good job. It's just associated with having your average job in Massachusetts. So that makes it a really nice natural experiment to work off of.
What about job loss? All the restaurant people are arguing that they're gonna have to, if they have to provide this health insurance, they're gonna have to cut back on.
Yeah, that wasn't necessarily something I entered into my equation just because I'm not looking at individuals who leave, who are unemployed for more than a year. Yeah, and the economy going with that made that difficult as well.
Are there
But-
fewer restaurants now in Massachusetts?
You know, I didn't completely look at that. That wasn't necessarily the focus of my thesis, but that's really an interesting point. I tried to account for some of that with, with my data on voluntary turnover by just looking at those who quit their job versus those who were fired.
Thank you very much for it.
Thank you.